Hi, I'm Meta Spencer. It's time for us to have another Schmooze Day. And the Schmooze Day on this show is one of the occasions when we don't know what we're going to talk about until we all get together. So I have friends with me, four friends that I want to bring together. And I can guess what a couple of them might be interested in talking about, but you never know. So let me tell you who they are. John Foster is an economist in Kingston, Ontario. He's a specialist in energy, and he knows more about the world's pipelines than anybody else I've ever met. So I'm always glad to tap into his wisdom when it comes to oil and gas pipelines around the world. And in here in Toronto, I presume, or nearby, is Alex Belyakov. Alex is a Ukrainian journalist. He was a journalist in Ukraine. He was very engaged with the Chernobyl events as he covered it in those days, but has been living in Canada for a number of years, although his whole family had to evacuate from the Donbass region where they lived. His parents, and I think his father died. His mother, he says, has just been an internally displaced person for the second time in her life, because now she had to move further away from the scene of battles. In some place like Kitchener is my dear old friend, Francisco Wolf. Frank is also an economist. He's also one of my three favorite former students in the world, or they were my best students. And he was a student of mine in peace and conflict studies. And in Ottawa is Angela McEwen, who has been working as an economist, among other things, with the Broadbent Institute and recently ran for Parliament. Let's start with John in the order I've given you. John, what do you like to talk about most in these days?
Well, it's a question of what I'm thinking about on the one hand, and for a second, am I prepared to talk about it, which is the second thing.
Oh,
I do want to test and share out, I suppose. That relates obviously to the terrible events going on in Ukraine, and to what's the end game? What's finally going to be the upshot? Peace. And of course, I do have an interest in the oil and gas, for which and the sanctions for which talks are hot in Brussels today.
I'd be very keen if we at least get around to talking about that, because there's been so much talk about can Europe get along without the gas and oil that they, especially I guess the gas that they've been importing from Russia, and how quickly can they transition? I think that's a fascinating topic. Anyway, Alex, hello. What is on your mind? I can imagine.
Well, I didn't choose this topic. The situation in Ukraine is too complex and I simply cannot ignore it. I am also blogging on my website from Chernobyl to Fukushima.com, where I analyze different nuclear risks during this war. And we already have 69th day of this war, so situation escalated so much, it's simply difficult not to talk or to write about it. And of course, I will be available to discuss this topic.
69 what, Alex?
We already have 69th day since war started on February 24th.
Well, I hadn't counted, but yeah, okay. Well, there's no way that we will skip that conversation, I'm sure. Frank, what's on your mind?
Well, I mean, for well over 15 years now, it's been very much a first thing on my mind, the whole challenge of climate change and climate change adaptation as it relates to our economic activity, the human economic activity on the planet, which I think is a really only variable that we as a species have to do anything about climate change. And I say that because I just want to put aside completely, because I don't think it's worth getting into the discussion of whether climate change is man-made or not.
Oh,
The
no.
fact is that we are human beings, and the only thing that we can modify is the behavior of human beings. And so we could consider whether there is a real problem or not. I think it is very real, very much real. And I think we are running out of time.
Yeah.
And it sounds like completely different to the Ukraine, but I actually think there is a very close relationship because of all these connections, this dependency on fossil fuels. And maybe I think sometimes perhaps the Ukraine war is crystallizing some of these decisions for humanity today. What are we going to build our future on? And it's not just the question of fossil fuels, but it's also the question of fundamental principles of what is society organized around, and what societies are we willing to relate to in the future, right? And do business with.
All right. Well, there's certainly a conversation there to be unpacked. Angela, yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. So much like Francisco, I'm very, very concerned about climate change, climate action, and I've been working on it from a labor union perspective in terms of what do we need to invest in order to transition the economy, and what types of institutions do we need to spur that investment? So I've been thinking a lot about the need for public investment in infrastructure. Canada has an infrastructure bank, but it's dedicated to public-private partnerships, which is kind of skimming the cream off the top and trying to find profitable ventures. But we actually need to invest in stuff that isn't necessarily going to be profitable. So that's the perfect place for the public sector to make that kind of investment. And so I'm thinking about this now in the context of the war in Ukraine, and will this actually prompt us to transition and make those investments that we need?
Faster.
And in terms faster, exactly.
Yeah.
And in terms of inflation, will this change how governments look at it? Will they be less willing to actually put the money they need to put into these investments because they're worried about inflation and monetary policy? And so what are the current challenges and opportunities given these kind of macroeconomic and global issues? We've also got issues with global supply chains given COVID and the war in Ukraine. So how it seems like there's a lot changing, and how can we organize ourselves to get the best outcome out of this moment?
All right. I see that basically some of the same issues are threading already through everything that we've already begun talking about. And I think really maybe the jumping off point would be the effect of the Ukraine war on the transition to sustainable energy sources, and how fast that will push us, or as you say, the inflation may even slow things down. So is that a starting point that we might give some thought to? So how do you see Canada as being affected by what's happening in Ukraine?
So Canada, I'm very concerned. I've seen lots of people talk about making investments in natural gas, that there will be a greater demand for natural gas, and that the same type of argument about our ethical oil, that we can replace Russian sources of fossil fuels and be less problematic socially source of these fossil fuels. But I think that's the wrong approach. I hope that we take this moment to actually transition off fossil fuels entirely and make the investments that we need in order to do that. So I do think that Canada, because we are sort of a petrol state, is very much implicated in this global transition and what's happening. Although I know that Europe is faced with some pretty deep questions about their ties and reliance on Russian oil and what to do right now. I do hope that Canada could be a more positive player in this, rather than investing in our own oil and gas as a solution.
I'm happy to jump in with a first. Let's see how this goes, Angela. With all much respect for where you're coming from, I think that the first thing that I would say about how the Ukraine crisis affects Canada on the energy side is that, of course, the most obvious thing, the price of gas goes up at the pump. And so everybody becomes immediately aware of the interconnectedness of markets, if we were not already aware of that. And then the problem is the difference between panic reactions versus strategic reactions, right? So the panic reaction is, oh, prices are going up, we got to do something about that, right? And release the emergency reserves, open up whatever, oil well we can find to try to address the supply issue. I would say, North America doesn't have the energy problem that Europe is having because of the Ukrainian crisis. And that's a very important first thing to keep in mind, right? It's not the same. The kind of energy crisis that Europe is having because of this is not what we're having here. What we're having is we could call it a market ricochet effect, like prices go up because energy is a worldwide commodity product. But the third world will suffer far more than we will, right? If it comes to that, like if we want to talk about just the market effect, the price, the cost of energy to the third world is, and the impact that all of that will have on food supply and all kinds of things is far more than what we're going to experience here in North America. So we have seen the price go up at the pump, but this is not something that is going to break the Canadian economy or is going to create some kind of a recession in Canada. It's not that, right? Europe has much bigger problems, and they do have to think about what they do about it. And I think when I sort of get over this first sort of a panic reaction, prices going up at the pump, and I try to think about what this really means, I think the first thing that the crisis means is that clearly, unfortunately perhaps, but now we can see with the benefit of hindsight that Europe made the wrong strategic decisions when it decided that an energy partnership with Russia was good for peace and for the world. And it was a gamble, it was a bet. And it was a very understandable one when it was made. This idea that you integrate with Russia, you bring them in, and somehow by creating these kinds of interdependencies, you make peace stronger, right? And you create a dynamic that's, unfortunately, it didn't work, right? Like whatever it was, and this is probably something worth studying, what worked and what didn't, and why it fell apart the way it did. But the reality is that Russia has behaved in a way that doesn't allow it to be seen anymore as a reliable partner for Europe in the first instance and for the West in general. And so Europe has a fundamental problem. They need to make quick adjustments. This is not going to happen by, I work in clean energy. S2E Technologies is a company that develops clean energy sources. It's not going to happen because we suddenly put in solar panels in every house in Europe. They will need oil and gas now, this year, next year, so they can replace Russian.
What about nuclear?
That is clear. And so Canada could be a much better partner for Europe in that equation. And for a couple of reasons. One, because Canada is a historical partner of Europe in all fronts. And second, because we're more likely than others to provide responsible governance to our energy sector. So in the short term sort of emergency response to the transition that Europe needs to go through, Canada may be part of the solution.
I think we're talking about developing natural gas deposits that actually it's going to take time to develop and deliver them. They haven't been developed yet. And developing them in BC right now, we have the RCMP invading Wet'suwet'en territory. We're demolishing, Site C is absolutely demolishing traditional territory. Like, we're actually not responsible developers of natural gas in a way that I would want to be. And so there's a lot of problems with Canada's natural gas.
I would not disagree with you. I would say that is
I
the
don't,
opportunity.
I think, and it would take time still, right? So Europe, I think, might want to reconsider nuclear as an option. Germany keeping nuclear plants online that they are planning to decommission, that is responsible. Obviously, solar isn't going to be the only thing, but there's lots of solutions. And I think that the key mistake here that Europe made was there was no plan B. Like, if you're making that kind of gamble with Russia, you need to have an alternative ready to go. And you can't put yourself in a position where you've relied on them so much, and you can't back out of it. I mean, obviously, hindsight, I'm sure they were difficult decisions involved in making this, but just sort of from a bystander position, it's clear that this was not, they became beholden to Russia, and it wasn't an equal partnership. Russia didn't need them as much as they needed Russia's gas.
Russia was prepared to use that as a weapon.
Exactly.
And Europe wasn't, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay, I want to hear what Alex has to say about your suggestion that the really responsible action would be simply for us to switch to nuclear. Alex has a history of being very involved as a journalist with Chernobyl.
I was involved with Chernobyl coverage, working for a daily newspaper in Kiev in early 1990s, and I have to visit the Chernobyl zone very often. I also published later peer-review publications about food security issues related to contamination of various areas in Ukraine, in Belarus, and even in Russia because of the Chernobyl disaster. So, of course, it's a complex issue, and I have been to Germany many times. I studied in Germany. What is really interesting to address in the context of our discussion, this is how the war in Ukraine collapsed many elephants in the room we have, and many people don't talk about them. And to bring together energy issues, Ukrainian situation, and climate change, I would like to address some problems we have from the beginning with environmental social governance rating. We had so much greenwashing and so much manipulations with all kinds of rankings. So right now, Europe and North America are surprised how we overlooked this problem with Russia. You didn't overlook them. You simply manipulated all rankings, creating different frameworks to make everything so nicely looking on the paper. So, of course, they overlooked. And if we go back to Sustainable Development Goals, developed by the UN, it shows very clear goal 16 related to peace, goal 17 related to partnerships. And, as a member of International Society of Sustainability Professionals, I had very interesting discussions in the last 2 months. But I wouldn't call them discussions. It was mostly me posting in our forum about SDG issues and how they related to Russian problems, and mostly silence on another back. I had number of members who actually involved in communication with me, but I was asking constantly, what is position of International Society of Sustainability Professionals on this situation? We have number of international organizations addressed it, and it was completely silent. I asked it on forums, and I was ignored. So one person actually provided very interesting comments for me from the US. This professional in sustainability told me, we always believed that ESG is not really about peace. From my point of view, he told me, it's mostly about climate change, maybe child labor issue, and so on.
I'm sorry, I'm lost. We always believe that ECG. What did you say?
It's not about peace.
ECG. What is ECG?
Environmental social governance. This is more about business, how they deal with such issues like
ESG.
climate change.
Yeah.
Maybe Francisco can provide some insight.
Yeah, no, just to clarify the concept, ESG, environmental and social governance, is sort of the general title that we give to what is now considered to be best practice or the proper way of governing anything, right? You have to take adequate consideration of environmental, social, and decision-making mechanisms for corporations, for institutions, but everywhere, right? So, and there's a whole body of codes and,
Well, that sounds way too global.
Practice.
What I want is a more specific answer to a challenge that Angela put out. Basically, Angela said the responsible response to the crisis of Europe's energy shortage now is to go back to using nuclear. And I would say, of all of the things that has come out of the war, the most obvious thing is it's made it very clear when the Russians went to Chernobyl and Zaporizhia, the huge power plant, that it is extremely risky to human survival to have reactors that they can shoot a hole in the damn thing and it's game over. It could be a meltdown, God knows what. I don't know the technology enough to know, but it sure wasn't fun, and it came close to being a catastrophe, and it could be a catastrophe. And they've not hardened these reactors in such a way as to make them less vulnerable to an attack. They can all be punctured without any trouble, as I understand it. So the idea that switching back to nuclear as an answer strikes me as jumping from the frying pan into the fire.
I mean, if Russia wanted to set off a nuclear bomb, they can. They have nuclear weapons. So whether or not we have nuclear reactors, it doesn't actually change.
Well,
the risk of nuclear war.
Apparently what happened was these stupid soldiers,
what happened is the soldiers didn't know how to operate Chernobyl.
That's right.
And it could have overheated. Chernobyl doesn't right now provide energy. It's not.
Well, no, there were reactors that hadn't been shut down.
There were reactors there that could have been a problem. Absolutely. But that's regardless. That's really a separate issue from.
Well, it's not, because in a war, people go around shooting.
In a war, they could drop a nuclear bomb. It's really no different than dropping a nuclear bomb, which they have.
It is different. Because the average soldier
international community.
Sorry, Angela, but the average soldier doesn't have access to a nuclear bomb. Only 2 or 3 people in the world can set off a third world war with a nuclear bomb. But a bunch of untrained soldiers can go around shooting holes in reactors, whether they
cannot
ask to do so.
They didn't. The problem wasn't that they were going to shoot a hole in the nuclear reactor. It was that it was not going to be. They got rid of all the staff that knew how to operate the facility, and that it wasn't going to be properly maintained. Russian commanders knew that if they let that go off, it would be the same in the eyes of the West as dropping a nuclear bomb, and our response would have been swift. I think whatever we think of Russia, this is a line that they have not yet crossed. Nuclear war.
They had soldiers out there digging up the dirt in a way that exposed them possibly to lethal. The soldiers themselves may die because they didn't know what they were doing. They were digging trenches and exposing themselves to lethal doses of radiation.
Absolutely.
The kind of thing can happen.
If they had blown up Chernobyl or allowed it to blow up, that would have been seen as an act of nuclear war by the West. And so that is a line I think they absolutely mistreat their soldiers and put them in dangerous situations.
We should never create anything that would cause a catastrophe, killing millions of people if it falls into the hands of somebody stupid, because eventually it will.
But I don't think that you can conflate nuclear power with nuclear war.
Well, I do.
Oh, okay, I think that's a mistake.
Absolutely. It is.
I think it's a very dangerous mistake.
In a war, and
all
any
power
war,
plants.
in any war, you're going to have people going around doing stupid things.
I don't know.
Absolutely.
Let's bring some other voices into this. I don't know. I do think there is a line. There is a difference between having an energy policy that says nuclear reactors are part of my energy matrix. That's one conversation, and another conversation is what are the risks of nuclear accidents on their military activities, right, and warfare, and what is the chance that there's going to be warfare in France? You know, why cannot France and Germany, the UK, Spain have nuclear reactors that are safely managed, and especially when you have to choose between evils, right? If your choices are all bad, I think you have to have these conversations. In that sense, I guess I am pragmatic, right?
Well,
I don't want to be ideological about it.
If you have regular soldiers shooting at a tanker that has natural gas, that would create a huge explosion and create very, very bad situation. You've had situations in other countries where fertilizer that was stored inappropriately in Beirut devastated a community. I think the idea of nuclear has become the consequences are outstripped, because in comparison with other things that we have as well, these are also dangerous. These can also create explosions that hurt a lot of people. And so we should also be concerned about the safety of natural gas plants in wartime situations, and fertilizer in wartime situations.
Can I have a go? Just jumping in as Meta
sure.
said. I'm one of those people who, you can tell the way I speak, cross the Atlantic. And I had been brought up, and in my early years of working in England, always conscious of the fact that the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons. They weren't very far away. The same, of course, as the United States had them, and Britain had them too, France. And so which comes back to what Francisco earlier mentioned, trade developed and investment developed between Europe, particularly Germany, leading the way, and Italy and France with what we now call Russia. This was, to me, a great joy. At last, a breaking down of this iron curtain, this lack of understanding between one set of people and another set of people. Oh, they don't have horns. They don't look like the devil incarnate. They're actually people in St. Petersburg who don't look much different from those people who walk around in Helsinki. So for 50, 60 years, this trade developed and developed. Certainly, from my point of view, pipelines, the gas, the oil trade helped. It was a mutual trade. And all this had worked, in my view, with success until February the 24th, 2022. All this time, I also recall that this is of course the Germany's Ostpolitik. All this time, the United States was saying energy security. Russia's a risk, or the Soviet Union is a risk. You can't rely upon those people to get the oil or the gas, and basically the oil and the gas. But for the oil, go to the Middle East, or go to Venezuela, or to come to us possibly, although the US finally became a net importer of oil. And so, but nothing happened that was ill. Now, the United States has been pushing this idea of energy security with a louder and louder over the past year, maybe the past 2 years, in regard to Nord Stream 2, about which we all know that it's now been jettisoned. And this was the game to break, in my view, Washington, where I've lived a number of years, to break the interconnection between West and East in Europe. And Western Europe is just a tip at the end of an enormous landmass, Eurasia. So we're in this mess. And the immediate reaction, it seems to me, is like the start of World War One, August the 4th. Everybody's leaping in this case, with 30 countries suddenly through packs all leaping in one direction. And the effect of that is not only this terrible war and its continuation with the supply of weaponry and the supply of trainers and so forth on our part, an enormous waste of resources and, of course, continuation of war. But I would say that the sanctions don't work. The trade uncertainties, the dislocations, of course, these price increases, oil, gas, and grain, and fertilizer and metals and stuff. And they're causing inflation, stagflation. In my view, Europe is cutting off its nose to spite its face. Canada is fairly intact in a way from this. And indeed, of course, Alberta and Saskatchewan benefit through the oil and gas and the fertilizers, the potash. But I come back again that the trade and the investment have been mutually beneficial. And I have a second obvious platitude to say, that is that war is bad for the health. It has to stop. And I've witnessed two personally, and a protagonist in one. And it's very hard for governments to stop once they're on the bandwagon of that terrible country over there, particularly with their armaments industry salivating. The shares of Lockheed Martin going up, and of course promotions in the military, and we'll go to 2% of GDP. And I might say the NDP and Liberals in lockstep on this. And I say why? That this has to stop. Somehow we have to get to how things had been before February 24. And how do you do that? The Russians, you have to listen to what the other people are saying and then say, okay, can I meet that? And what are the consequences if I don't? Well, we've seen a consequence, a terrible war. But one thing they had been asking for was for the proper execution of the Helsinki Accords, meaning indivisible security within Greater Europe for everybody. And that includes them. So from their point of view, they saw Europe completely ganged up on them. And then they saw their kind of estranged cousin country in Ukraine prizing away, certainly with enormous encouragement from the West, Canada particularly, with the United States and United Kingdom.
Are you suggesting that what we need to do is just do whatever Russia wants and that would put an end to it?
I don't. I say you have to talk to them.
Okay.
So I don't think that's a really good assessment of what's happening. This has been going on since before 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea. And actually the Liberals, if you look at defense spending in Canada, they've been increasing defense spending dramatically ever since they've been elected. It's grown substantially. This year's budget didn't increase it very much compared to what they have been planning to increase it at anyway. They've also been planning, so I used to be in the Naval Reserves. The new ships that they're planning to buy will have ports that could fit intercontinental ballistic missiles to be part of strategic missile defense globally. The United States is moving away from land-based strategic missile defense to ship-based strategic missile defense. And France and the UK have ships that have this capability. Canada will now have ships that have this capability. We haven't procured the missiles yet, but the people who are and have been for several years thrilled about this tension with Russia I absolutely agree with John, is that's defense contractors. That's who's been making the money on both sides. That has accelerated with the global response to Ukraine because we can't help defend them. All we can do is send them arms or money to buy arms. That is mostly what we've done. And so while Canada has been helping to do training for soldiers for several years in Ukraine, what we've done in response is mostly help them purchase weapons.
Helping Ukraine. I would think that a Ukrainian might have an opinion about whether it was a good thing or not, since our only Ukrainian here is someone whose family had to evacuate and be refugees inside Ukraine way before February 24th. So tell me, would you say that all we need to do, Alex, is have Ukraine and Russia have a conversation about going back to what things were like before February 24th, or would you have a different proposal?
Well, thank you for opportunity to continue. And if you don't mind, before I answer this question, I still would like to finish my thought on environmental social governance and explain why this topic is extremely important from my point of view. ESG criteria is one of the critical criteria how investors decide whether to invest milliards of dollars in something or not, also including nuclear power. And all energy issues we have at the moment are strictly related to the indexes how ESG related to investment. And you know, at the moment, Europeans are discussing to consider nuclear energy like clean alternative for climate change and other issues. So if nuclear energy will be included in this alternative mix, it means that money going to alternative energy will be going not to green energy, they will be going to nuclear energy, they will be going to gas and other sources because it's clean alternative. And this explains a lot how Europe is financing this war between Russia and Ukraine. You know, it's very difficult to say that Russia is supposed to sit with Ukraine and discuss this war at the time that Europe gives to Russia milliards every single month and every single day for gas and energy supply. So from my point of view, we again don't addressing many elephants in this room, and I am glad that we speak about energy mix and other issues. And going back to nuclear safety and nuclear issues with Chernobyl, thank you, Angela, for addressing Chernobyl issues. But you know, we are completely overlooking Zaporizhia nuclear power station, and it's occupied by Russian military at the moment. And Zaporizhia nuclear power station was actually attacked by a rocket from Russia, and you can easily Google a video of this attack. This is completely overlooked. And yes, to have nuclear safety is very, very important. But again, nuclear power stations can be another example of nuclear weapons if countries like Russia decide to attack a nuclear power station. And this is the first time in the history of the world that nuclear power stations were actually part of military conflict in Ukraine. You know, there are many things we don't address properly during this conflict. And going back to 2014, you know, many Western countries behaved very weak and didn't react properly to this beginning. And right now, what we have is just something that started 8 years ago. And again, we have 69th day of the war. It's also a long time for the second phase of this war to react properly, and many countries still discussing, I would say, not very prioritized issues. And of course, I am very biased in this situation because my mom and my brother are affected and they became internally displaced persons again. And I see stories from my wife's parents who live in Kiev area. They all are affected, and we are still lucky that they are actually alive. But you know, because Germany decided to save few euros on utilities. Yes, whole world is facing this problem, and even the European Union, who is ready to introduce the sixth package of sanctions, they publicly published in their reports that well, let's say all leading countries in the European Union, like France, like Germany, and some others, they supplied military weapons and everything else to Russia since 2014, ignoring their previous sanctions. You know, this situation is so terrible. I will say it's not about Ukraine anymore, and it was never about Ukraine. It's not Russia-Ukraine war. We just need to be honest, transparent, and finally going back to integrity issues.
Mhm.
This didn't start on 24th February of this year. The war started long time ago, and everybody contributed to this. And Ukrainian soldiers are opening Russian tanks and shows electronics that was supplied from France, electronics that was supplied from made in European Union countries. You know, at the moment, both sides of conflicts receive military weapons from
But
countries that are trying to solve the problem.
so
How you
I'm going to
can
jump
solve the
in.
problem at the time you are supplying Russia every day with huge amount of money and providing weapons? Yeah, it's
Yeah,
very
but
complex.
of course, I mean, that is an easy line to convey, and it's very difficult to disagree. I mean, I agree with everything you were just saying, except that I don't also in the spirit of objectivity and balance in the conversation, I don't think it's fair to say and it's said, everybody says it all the time these days, you know, Europe is financing the Russian war on Ukraine. Clearly, when they enter into these gas agreements, they were not, or when they entered into all these other trade relations, they were not intending to finance Russian military campaigns in the Ukraine or anywhere else. That was not the purpose of this business transactions. The purpose was actually to build peace. It didn't work. So I think that needs to be assessed. And John was speaking about this, like perhaps I suffer of economist bias, right? But as an economist, I like to believe that economic relationships and integration is better than isolation and a world that is divided in islands, right? That can see each other from a distance and can be cautious or fearful of each other. You see, I mean, these days it's very, very common to put down globalization, but I like globalization. I like the dream of globalization. This idea of one world, one people, one market, right?
Yeah, there's benefits to that, but I think economists tend to put too much weight on how that can create a bridge. Right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And what we're learning, to me, this is what matters about this conversation. What Ukraine is crystallizing is that trade policy and investment policy on its own is not enough.
No.
Right? And that you cannot, whatever you do there, you cannot overlook governance. You cannot overlook fundamental principles of rule of law, human rights, democracy. This is essential. And, you know, I am, by the way, I don't know if you guys know this, but I am originally Venezuelan. So I'm Canadian. My family came to Canada. I'm very proud to be Canadian as well. But I was born and raised in Venezuela, left there when I was 20, went back several years later to work as an international development professional in infrastructure and public-private deals all over South America. So we have a lot of points in common there. And then I saw my country which was, this is the paradise, if there was ever a paradise, right? A country that had everything fall completely apart because of bad governance, right? And we don't need to get into right and left sort of ideologies. Clearly bad governance, right? As it was happening, as it was very clear to anybody who had basic training about proper, public policy and governance, very clear that this country was being mismanaged. All these geopolitical considerations came to play, and some people wanted to do investments in Venezuela, and some people wanted because they had oil, and so I see this happening over and over again. And I hope that what Ukraine is teaching the West is that we have to be a lot more serious when it comes to understanding what it means to hold values such as human rights, democracy, freedom of the press, very basic things. You cannot do business. You cannot do business with countries that don't have a bare minimum agreement on fundamental concepts of rule of law. And this has to stop being something that we just use for positioning and for discourse. It has to become a hard line. And I don't know where that will go. I don't know if then that will create these islands of bad behavior. And I have a lot of sympathy for many Russians who live in Russia and who don't like what's happening in Russia. And I don't want to abandon them. But I think that there are fundamental behaviors that we have with the best of intentions that we took that were enabling behaviors towards the bad guys. And we have to learn from our mistakes, and we have to be humble enough to say, yes, we did it with the best of our intentions or whatever, but it didn't work, it failed, we cannot do that anymore.
Wow.
Not from teaching other countries how to behave. Should we do so by regime change and through sanctions?
Well,
my concern is that is the weapon that's being used enormously in the last several years in the case of Venezuela, Iran, Syria, now Russia, and so forth. I don't buy in.
Very good question. I think we have to go there. We have to go there. This is an area, this is an incomplete subject matter. We have not done the homework properly, and we have gone to the exam a few times already in the past 30 years and gotten out of it either through cheating or walking out of the classroom before the bell goes off. We have to finish the homework. We have to understand what it means to interact with a country that behaves badly in the concert of nations. We really have to deal with that question fully. I don't know if sanctions, economic sanctions, are. They are not the full solution. But
what else do we have? That's really such an important question.
How do you deal with a bully in the schoolyard? Well, how do you deal with a bully in the concert of nations? How can Russia be a member of the UN Human Rights Committee? How can Venezuela be proposed to be a member of the Human Rights Committee? We do this all the time with Middle Eastern countries as well. Like, we have to start drawing this line and saying, this is good behavior, and you can be one of the community of nations. And if you don't meet these requirements, you cannot be one of the community of nations. And I don't know what that means then. We have to probably start discussing what it means to be left outside of the community of nations, but it has to have clear consequences.
This supposes, however, that our own behavior and that of our allies, and indeed our most important in principle, overwhelming ally, the United States, themselves behave in an ethical fashion. And I would say that may be, that I don't believe that the sanctions are necessarily put on for good behavior in the other country, but in hope for a change of government to a government that we don't happen to like. And then I'd have to say, what about, this is the what about thing, what about Yemen? Is a war that continues, Syria, a mess. Are we saints? And I would say in all this, there are no saints.
Well, if I may, I would like to go back to behavioral issues and use example of my 4-year-old son. I really like it what Francisco said about bully. And I have very good example how 4-year-old can understand something that we as adult cannot. My son asked my wife after attending kindergarten someday, Mom, did Putin attend childcare and kindergarten? Or can you tell us maybe he had some problems like special needs? And my wife asked why. But he behaves so badly. We learn in kindergarten how to behave. And only people like with special needs need a little bit longer to learn how to behave. And this 4-year-old person who understands more about this world than some adult. It's very sad,
It was beautiful. I
Yeah.
love
And
that.
Alex, I think you made a comment earlier about France profiting off of selling weapons to Russia. Here in Canada, we've talked about how Canada shouldn't be selling arms to Israel right now. They shouldn't be selling arms to Saudi Arabia. Why should we be profiting? Like, I don't know. I think John raises a great point about the sanctions. And what type of behavior we sanction. I think that's the problematic part. It's like stuff we don't like. It's not necessarily the worst human rights abuses that we sanction. It's actually more to keep people in line with the capitalist economy and to make sure that people are behaving in that global way that we like is how I often view it. I started off with a degree in international development, so that's my bias, is that structural adjustment policies are bad and are to discipline nations to behave appropriately in the capitalist context. But we should at least not be profiting from human rights abuses. We should not be profiting from war, and whatever we can do to make that happen, I think it is something that we need to talk about more.
I also think it's a bit of a we call that a red herring to say, oh, we're all sinners, right?
Right.
None of us are saints, so we should all be treated the same anyway. It's like, no, I'm sorry. Like, Canada is not perfect. You were talking earlier about, we have our own issues with Indigenous people, with the way we do all kinds of things. Canada is not perfect. America is certainly not perfect. As a Latin American, I know that. But to me, there is a line between a country where there is democracy, separation of powers, freedom of the press, basic principles of governance, and a country where there's not. And to me, we should not trade with countries that don't have those basic principles of good governance in the same way that we trade with countries that do. And I am not saying that being a democracy makes you a perfect country. No, I am not. And we're always trying to be better, absolutely. But that line to me has to mean something. And that includes, just to get myself in trouble, Israel is a democracy. So I would trade with Israel. It's a perfect democracy, far from it. Many problems with Israel. And we as democracies should talk about it in the way democratic countries have debates inside the country and with each other. But Saudi Arabia is not. So we cannot deal with Saudi Arabia in the same way that we deal with Israel. And, China is not. And we cannot deal with China in the same way we deal with America, we as Canadians, right? Two economies are very important to Canada. We cannot treat them in the same way. There are fundamental differences in the way, not just the economies, but the nations work. And we have profound disagreements with the Americans on many things. But we can have them. This is the thing. We can have them in a reasonable way. This is not the case with China. When we have a certain kind of disagreement, then suddenly Canadian citizens that happen to be in China are put in jail because of mysterious reasons, right? So that's not the way, to have proper relationships between nations. And to me, that line, which I've had it very clear for a long time, I think Ukraine is helping us understand today. And just to give one point to the John's point before, when we assess Europe's policies towards Russia, which I consider today, it's fair to say, failed, we should also consider that it succeeded bringing a whole bunch of these peripheral countries, the former USSR countries, closer to the principles of democracy and free market and freedom of the press. And the perfect example of that is Ukraine itself, right? Ukraine is today a far freer country than it ever was under the USSR, and that is thanks to this policy of rapprochement, right? And so it's not a black and white thing. It works sometimes. We have to learn more about why it works sometimes and what makes it work, what makes it fail, and maybe there is a refinement of the policy that is needed.
Should I suggest that maybe then we should look at our trade with the United Kingdom from the point of view of the treatment of Julian Assange, who is hardly reported on in our newspapers, but we know that he's in fact been locked away, awaiting extradition to the United States for about 2 years, and I suspect that he's been fixed.
Well, we certainly have had a full airing of a very basic controversy, and I've never heard it formulated quite the way Frank did, but I'm really glad that you did, because I think that is, you've put it in such clear terms that I think those are the terms we have to actually address it in. But nobody has come up with an anywhere near satisfactory answer to you. But I think we sure have our homework to do now, because you've really set it up better than anybody else I've ever heard. And I guess John is probably the best opponent if we're looking for a real debate. The two of you would have a very good time. So maybe we better get you back together again. Anyway, our time is up, and I'm extremely grateful to all of you, because I think this really did, to my mind, bring into, you use the word crystallized, that the war has crystallized some questions that we have evaded. And now I think we have to face them. And it's changed the whole dynamics. So we shall see what we shall see. It's all coming down the pike right now. Thank you very much, everybody. I've enjoyed this. And
thank you. Thank you. Very, very stimulating conversation. Very much enjoyed.
Bye. Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week, and sometimes more. This is episode 446. You can watch these or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. And when you get there to the website, look around. We have conversations going on there all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. I'll see you there.